So here I want to cover the selection tools in Photoshop. Over the years, the selection tools have gone through a lot of, not necessarily changes, but have evolved in different ways. So there are more ways to select things in a composition than there has ever been, and it's pretty much easier than it's ever been. So one of the main new features in Photoshop is this object selection tool. So if you look over here, I have the object selection tool highlighted. It's a little triangle pointing to a box. If you have it selected, you'll have some features up in this horizontal menu that are already set. And the way it works is basically you hover over something in the composition, it will highlight with a certain color, and it will identify that as something that's selectable. So it's looking for objects in the scene that can be turned into selections, and you can click on something then. Now it's selected, and I can do something with this. For example, one of the things I could do is maybe go to image and adjust the color of something based on the selection. So here I'm just changing the color of this statue. So the object selection tool makes the process really easy, but it was never that easy. There was always a number of steps you would have to take to get a good selection of something. So I want to take you backwards to the tools that are used to create selections and talk about the most basic ones before I get into some of the new selection features that are really easy to use. Because what happens is, even with these more advanced selection tools, they're not 100% perfect, and you'll often have to refine your selection, and that's where the more basic selection tools will come in. In the very early days of Photoshop, there was really just 2 or 3 ways to select things, and that was with this Marquee Selection Tool up here. So the Marquee Selection Tool is the second icon in the toolbar, and you basically have 4 different types of selections that you can take advantage of. When you left click on that Marquee Selection Tool, you get the Rectangular Marquee Selection Tool. There's an elliptical selection tool, and then there's a selection tool that represents just one single row of pixels and one single column of pixels. These can be used in different ways, but really the 2 selection tools that you'll use most often will be the rectangular and the elliptical selection tool, and the keyboard shortcut is M. You have to realize too, with many of these icons in your toolbar, it's not just one tool, but it could be several tools that become available when you click on that icon. So you have several different types of marquee selections here. When I select the rectangular marquee selection tool, which is the default one, for example, my toolbar across the top, the horizontal toolbar, it's called the context bar as well, it's going to have several features. So you have these first 4 icons that represent ways to combine selections. You have a category here called feather. So feather will basically smooth out a selection, and you can do that by giving the feather item here a size in pixels. So that's how much you can smooth something out. There's an anti-aliasing option, so that will help smooth things out. And then you have this style option here, and what style does, it will give you different set size selections. So if I say fixed ratio, for example, I can put in pixel values here, and it will always create a selection based on those pixel values. And then there's this final button here called select and mask, and that brings up a special window where you can refine the selection even further. So with the Marquee Selection Tool, it's just a matter of left clicking, dragging, you get measurements in pixels if pixels are your default measurements set in the document. And the selection is identified by this line, this dashed line. So they often call this the marching ants, this little dashed line. So everything within that is what's being selected. So if I want to affect this area, let's say, going back to how I can change color, I can go to Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation, and change color inside that area. So affecting the color based on the selection. So just clicking and dragging creates a selection. If you want to get rid of a selection, you can hit Command D or Control D, and that gets rid of the selection. Now, selections are used a lot, so there is a menu item dedicated just to selections, and it's this select menu item up here. So there's a lot of different features, but you'll see in here are some of the things that you'll do most often, such as selecting all, which is Command A, so you're selecting everything. Deselecting, which is Command D or Control D on a PC, so that's getting rid of the selection. And then you can invert your selection, so you can go into select and say inverse, that inverts it. And you can also use a shortcut combination for that. So the shortcut combination to invert your selection is Shift Command or Shift Control I on a PC. It's good to remember Command D to deselect and Shift Command I to invert, because those are some very common things you'll be doing. Now the 4 boxes up here represent ways to combine your different selections. So let's say you select the second box, and that is going to merge. So every time I create a new rectangular selection with the Rectangular Marquee tool, it's adding to it, so I get this abstract type selection. The next box after that is a subtraction operation. So if I select something and then I left click and drag a new selection, it's going to cut away. And the third box is an invert operation. So if I have a selection and then I left click and drag, it's going to basically select those overlapping areas. I rarely use these, and instead I use keyboard shortcut. So if you use, for example, the shift after you make a selection, you can shift and drag new selections to add to those selections. You can option click and drag to remove selections, or use a selection to delete from another selection. And in combination, shift and option will perform the intersection type operation. And you can also see too, when you use these different keyboard shortcuts, the appropriate icon and the horizontal bar on top will light up as well. Now elliptical selections work the same way. If you hit shift and drag from the very beginning, you're going to get a perfect circle if I use the elliptical selection here while hitting shift and drag. If I hit shift option drag, it's going to create that selection from a center point, the first point that I click with the mouse. But if I just hit shift by itself, it's going to go in from like the corner, the upper top left corner. Now to show you feathering in action, I really have to copy a selection and paste it on a new layer. So here there's a value already set. I'll put this feathering back to 0. I'll make an elliptical selection, and then I will do a Command C and a Command V. So just copying and pasting. Basically all I'm doing is copying and pasting that into a new layer. So it's not destroying the original layer, I'm just copying and pasting with my shortcuts. And to show you that when I do that and the feathering is set to 0, I get this really hard edge. Now if I want to get like a smoother edge, a softer edge, what I can do is go into feathering and raise that number up a little bit. So I will raise it up to, let's say, 21. I'm just left click hovering over that and dragging. Now I'm going to create my selection. I'm going to go back to that background layer, and then I'm going to copy and paste that. And then if you look at this selection, you can see the feathering and what that feathering is. And basically it's creating a transition from 100% opacity to 0 opacity. So it gives you this kind of smooth type edge instead of a hard line edge. And that's using feathering. So feathering is great when you're compositing two things together and you want to create some sort of transitional effect. So those are the most basic selection tools you'll ever use, just the Marquee Selection tools. And from there, we have the lasso tools, so you can create more abstract type selections with these tools. And then you have the specialty type selection tools. And one is the object selection tool, which I started the video with, which is pretty revolutionary. You just click on an object and it creates a selection. Another one is this quick selection tool, which is good for refining. And then you have a magic wand tool. It's basically you click on a pixel of a certain color and all the same colored pixels in the image will get selected. And there's ways you can modify those shortcuts as well. But overall, the first 3 icons after the initial icon, the move tool, are for your selections. You have Marquee Selection tools, lasso based selection tools, and this final category, which are, you could say, more advanced type selection tools or more automated type selection tools.